In just 14 days, every house on Maple Street had been sold. One by one, bright yellow sold signs appeared along the quiet road, while moving trucks carried away decades of family memories. The entire town celebrated the promise of a $4.8 billion luxury resort that everyone believed would change their future forever. Only one weathered wooden house remained. Its owner wasn't a wealthy businessman or a stubborn land developer. She was Grace Whitmore, a 44-year-old plus-size school bus driver, raising her teenage son while caring for her father, whose fading memories disappeared a little more each day. People called her selfish. The local news called her the obstacle standing in the way of progress. Then billionaire Vincent DeMarco, the man Wall Street secretly nicknamed the Mafia Boss, walked into her yard. He didn't offer more money. He didn't threaten her. Instead, after noticing a single worn stone beneath an ancient oak tree, he quietly ordered his executives to redesign the entire project. No one understood how one forgotten stone could be worth more than billions of dollars, until the truth buried beneath Grace's home forced an entire town to question everything it thought it knew. By the time the first school bell rang each morning, Grace Whitmore had already driven nearly 40 miles through the winding mountain roads outside Ashcroft, Colorado. For 18 years, she had been the familiar face behind bus number 12. Every child knew her name. Every parent trusted her. Every afternoon, she waited until the last student had safely stepped through their front door before pulling away from the curb. It wasn't extraordinary work. But to Grace, it mattered. After her shift, she drove home to the same modest cedar house that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. The white paint had long since faded. The porch leaned slightly to one side. The wooden swing hanging beneath the old oak tree creaked whenever the afternoon wind rolled down from the mountains. To strangers, it looked like the oldest and least valuable property left on Maple Street. To Grace, it was the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Inside, life followed another routine. Her 16-year-old son, Eli, usually had homework spread across the kitchen table while trying to ignore the constant news reports discussing the town's future. Upstairs, Walter Whitmore spent most afternoons drifting between fragments of memory. Some days he believed Grace was still 10 years old. Other days he asked why his late wife hadn't come home from work. The Alzheimer's disease had stolen almost everything, except one strange habit. Nearly every evening, Walter would pause near the basement door. He would stare at the old wooden floor for several silent seconds before whispering the same sentence. "Don't forget what's sleeping beneath the house." The first time he had said it, Grace thought he was dreaming. The 20th time, she assumed it was another symptom of the disease. By the 100th, she barely noticed anymore. Doctors often explained that Alzheimer's patients repeated familiar thoughts because damaged memories became trapped inside endless loops. Grace accepted that explanation. She had no reason not to. Life was already complicated enough. Then DeMarco Holdings arrived. The announcement spread through Ashcroft faster than a summer wildfire. A luxury mountain resort, private lakes, boutique hotels, conference centers, a championship golf course. Nearly 6,000 permanent jobs, restaurants, medical facilities, scholarship programs. For a town whose younger generation had spent years leaving for Denver or Colorado Springs in search of better opportunities, it sounded almost miraculous. Within days, representatives from DeMarco Holdings began knocking on every door. The offers were generous, far beyond market value. Many families accepted before finishing the conversation. Some cried with happiness after signing. Others immediately began searching for larger homes in neighboring counties. Every sale was celebrated across social media. Every closing became another headline proving that Ashcroft's future had finally arrived. Then the sales stopped. One address remained highlighted in red on every acquisition map inside the company's temporary headquarters. 112 Maple Street. Grace Whitmore. Offer declined. Offer declined again. Final offer declined. Daniel Cross, the executive overseeing acquisitions, couldn't understand it. He increased the amount. Grace politely refused. He added relocation assistance. She smiled and refused again. He even offered lifetime financial security for her family. Grace thanked him for his kindness, before quietly saying the same words she had repeated from the beginning. "I'm not selling." Daniel eventually stopped asking why. He simply marked the property as a legal obstacle. The town, however, created its own explanation. People who had once waved at Grace during morning coffee suddenly looked away. Neighbors lowered their voices whenever she walked past. Someone posted online that she was trying to extort millions from the developers. Another claimed she secretly planned to sue the company. A local radio host called her the woman holding an entire community hostage. The phrase spread quickly. Within 48 hours, everyone seemed to believe it. One afternoon, Grace walked into Miller's grocery to buy milk and medication for her father. Conversations stopped. An elderly man shook his head. A woman whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Some people would rather protect rotten wood than their own town. Grace didn't answer. She paid for her groceries and left. She had learned years earlier that silence often survived longer than arguments. That evening, Mayor Thomas Callahan knocked on her door. Unlike the reporters, he removed his hat before speaking. "I came as a neighbor," he said gently. "We all know you've had a hard life." He glanced toward Walter's wheelchair beside the living room window. "And everyone respects what you've done for your father." Grace appreciated the kindness, until his next sentence. "But maybe it's time to think about the greater good." He explained that the resort would transform Ashcroft forever. Children would have better schools. Families would have better hospitals. Small businesses would thrive. "One old house," he said, "shouldn't stand in the way of thousands of futures." Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she invited him onto the porch. Together they looked across Maple Street, where moving trucks stood outside nearly every home. Finally, she spoke. "If I believed money was the most valuable thing this house could give my family," she paused, "I would have signed the first offer." The mayor searched her face, hoping she might explain further. She didn't. After he left, Grace remained on the porch until sunset. Behind her, Walter slowly shuffled toward the basement door once again. His cloudy eyes settled on the worn wooden floor. His trembling fingers pointed downward. Then, with surprising clarity, he whispered words that sent an unfamiliar chill through Grace. They covered the door. He frowned, as though fighting through decades of forgotten memories. They promised they'd come back. His breathing grew heavier. The box. A long silence followed. Then he looked directly at Grace, something he hadn't done in weeks. "Don't let them pour concrete over it." Grace stood frozen. Before she could ask what he meant, the confusion returned to his face. He smiled weakly, asked whether dinner was ready, and wandered toward the kitchen as though nothing had happened. Late that night, unable to sleep, Grace carried a flashlight into the basement. The room smelled of old timber and damp earth. Most of the floor was hidden beneath shelves, storage boxes, and decades of forgotten tools. As she dragged aside a rusted cabinet that hadn't been moved in years, her flashlight swept across the floorboards. Near the far corner, she noticed a narrow outline in the wood, perfectly rectangular, almost invisible beneath layers of dust, as though someone, many years ago, had deliberately hidden a door. Grace knelt beside the outline in the basement floor, running her fingertips across the narrow seam hidden beneath decades of dust. It wasn't imagination. Someone had carefully fitted the wooden planks together so perfectly that they blended into the rest of the floor. Whoever built it had never intended for it to be found again. The next morning, after dropping off the last group of elementary school students, Grace stopped by the hardware store instead of driving home. She bought a pry bar, a heavy flashlight, and a pair of work gloves. She told herself she was only satisfying her curiosity. Nothing more. Back at the house, Eli helped move the remaining storage shelves while Walter slept upstairs. For nearly an hour, mother and son worked in silence. Finally, the pry bar slipped beneath the edge of one weathered plank. The wood resisted. Then came a dull crack. A rush of cool air escaped from below, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp earth and ancient timber. Eli looked at his mother. "You sure you want to do this?" Grace nodded, although she wasn't nearly as confident as she appeared. Together, they lifted the heavy wooden hatch. Beneath it, a narrow stone staircase disappeared into darkness. "There wasn't supposed to be a basement under the basement," Eli whispered. Neither of them laughed. Grace switched on the flashlight and slowly descended. Each step echoed softly through the confined space. The walls were built from rough-cut stone instead of poured concrete, suggesting the chamber had existed long before the current house was renovated. At the bottom stood a room no larger than a garden shed. Dust coated everything. Old wooden shelves lined one wall. A rusted oil lantern still hung from a hook. In one corner rested a cedar chest, wrapped in faded canvas. It was the only object untouched by moisture. Grace carefully brushed away the dust. Burned into the lid were two initials: A.W., Arthur Whitmore, her grandfather, the man she had never met. With trembling hands, she opened the chest. Inside lay three carefully preserved objects: a leather-bound journal, a rolled-up map tied with blue ribbon, and an ornate brass key unlike anything she had ever seen. No gold, no jewelry, no hidden fortune, just paper. Grace almost smiled. So this is what Grandpa hid? Eli picked up the map while Grace opened the journal. The first pages contained ordinary entries: weather, crop reports, town meetings. Then the handwriting changed. The words became hurried, uneven, as though written during extraordinary circumstances. One sentence immediately caught her attention. "If anyone ever finds this, remember that the truth belongs to the town, not to the men who rewrote its history." Grace read the line twice. She looked toward Eli. Neither of them understood what it meant. Meanwhile, less than 2 miles away, tension was building inside the temporary headquarters of DeMarco Holdings. Large digital displays showed construction schedules, engineering models, and financial projections. Every delay cost money. Every hour without demolition pushed the opening date further into the future. Daniel Cross entered the executive conference room carrying updated acquisition reports. "Everything is ready," he announced. "We've secured every parcel except Whitmore's property." The room remained silent. At the far end of the table sat Vincent DeMarco. He had spent the morning reviewing geological surveys, historic land records, property transfers dating back almost 80 years. Something didn't fit. The survey marker beneath the old oak tree matched symbols he remembered seeing as a boy inside one of his father's journals. Not identical, but close enough to make him uncomfortable. He closed the file. "No excavation crews enter Maple Street." Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry? No demolition, but the investors approved excavation beginning Monday." Vincent folded his hands. "I've changed the schedule." One executive leaned forward. "Based on what?" Vincent answered without raising his voice. "An inconsistency." The room exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel couldn't hide his frustration. "With respect, sir, we're talking about a $4.8 billion development. We're also talking about a decision we'll live with long after the profits are forgotten." No one spoke again. They had worked with Vincent long enough to recognize the conversation was over. Outside the conference room, however, another meeting quickly began. The investment partners weren't pleased. Every postponed day meant additional costs, equipment rentals, contract penalties, interest payments, millions of dollars disappearing before construction had even started. Rumors spread through the company almost immediately. Some believed Vincent had discovered an environmental problem. Others whispered that Grace Whitmore had found a legal loophole. No one imagined the truth involved a forgotten piece of local history. That evening, Eleanor Hayes, a reporter for the Ashcroft Chronicle, parked outside Grace's house. She expected another argument. Another refusal. Instead, she found Grace sitting quietly on the porch while Walter watched the sunset beside her. "Can I ask one question?" Eleanor said. Grace nodded. "If they doubled the offer tomorrow, would you finally sell?" Grace looked across Maple Street. Every neighboring house stood empty now. Curtains gone, mailboxes removed. The street had become strangely silent. She answered with complete honesty. "I honestly don't know. It wasn't the money anymore. It was the feeling, growing inside her, that her father had been trying to protect something far more important than a building." Late that night, after Walter had fallen asleep, Grace returned to the hidden chamber alone. She continued reading Arthur Whitmore's journal from the beginning. Several pages had become too faded to read. Others described ordinary life in Ashcroft during the early 1960s. Then, halfway through the journal, she found several pages that had been deliberately torn out. Not damaged by time. Removed. Carefully. Someone had wanted those pages to disappear. The next surviving entry was written several weeks later. The handwriting shook across the page. "If you're reading this, then they failed to erase everything. The map will lead you to the place they couldn't destroy. But before you follow it, you must understand why the town agreed to forget." Grace slowly unrolled the old map. It wasn't a map of Colorado. It was a detailed hand-drawn survey of Maple Street itself. Near the center, someone had circled one location in red ink. Not the house, not the oak tree, but a spot beneath the future entrance of the luxury resort. And beside that circle, Arthur had written just 4 chilling words. "This is where it happened." Grace barely slept that night. Arthur Whitmore's journal remained open on the kitchen table, while the hand-drawn map lay beside it. She traced the faded red circle again and again, trying to understand why her grandfather had marked a location that no longer existed. According to the modern construction plans, the circle now sat beneath the main entrance of DeMarco Holdings' future luxury resort. If Arthur had been telling the truth, millions of tons of concrete would soon bury whatever history remained forever. The following morning, Grace called the Ashcroft Historical Society. No answer. She tried the county archives. The receptionist politely explained that many municipal records from the 1960s had been lost after a courthouse flood decades earlier. It sounded like bad luck, but Grace was beginning to wonder whether it had really been an accident. Eleanor Hayes, the local reporter, arrived just before noon after receiving a short message from Grace. "I found something," Grace said quietly. An hour later, the 2 women sat surrounded by yellowed documents, maps, and Arthur's journal. Eleanor adjusted her glasses while studying the handwriting. "This isn't the journal of someone hiding treasure," she murmured. "It's the journal of someone trying to preserve evidence." Grace nodded. Evidence of what? Neither woman knew. But Eleanor recognized one detail. The survey markings on Arthur's map resembled symbols used before modern county maps existed. "If we can find the original land survey," she said, "we might understand what your grandfather was trying to protect." Across town, Vincent DeMarco was searching for answers of his own. Instead of attending another investor meeting, he drove alone to the county courthouse. Most people expected billionaires to send lawyers. Vincent preferred reading original records himself. An elderly county clerk led him into a storage room where dusty leather-bound ledgers filled aging shelves. "You probably won't find much," she apologized. "Half our records disappeared years ago." Vincent simply smiled. Sometimes what's missing tells a bigger story than what's left behind. For nearly 3 hours, he compared property boundaries, railroad surveys, insurance maps, and handwritten engineering notes. Finally, one brittle document caught his attention. It was dated October 1964. The page contained a request to redraw Maple Street after a public safety incident. The strange part wasn't the request. It was what followed. Every description of the incident had been blacked out, not faded, not damaged, intentionally covered with thick black government ink. Someone had wanted future generations to know an event had happened, but never discover what it was. Vincent quietly photographed the page before leaving. By sunset, both Grace and Vincent had independently reached the same conclusion. Someone had erased history. The question was why. That evening, Grace visited the Evergreen Retirement Center after Eleanor suggested speaking with the oldest surviving residents of Ashcroft. Most remembered nothing unusual. Some couldn't remember Maple Street at all. Then they met 91-year-old Margaret Ellis. She stared at Arthur's photograph for nearly a full minute. "I knew him," she whispered. "He wasn't famous. He never wanted to be." Grace leaned forward. "What happened?" Margaret frowned, searching through memories buried beneath 6 decades. There were children. She closed her eyes. A school bus. Her breathing became uneven. "I remember smoke." Then silence. She shook her head. "The rest is gone." Although incomplete, it was the first time anyone had connected Arthur Whitmore to a real historical event. Outside, Eleanor looked both excited and frustrated. "It's like everyone remembers pieces of the same nightmare." Grace looked toward the mountains glowing beneath the evening sun. What if that's exactly what happened? Meanwhile, pressure inside DeMarco Holdings was becoming unbearable. The board demanded an emergency meeting. Daniel Cross projected financial charts across the conference room wall. "Every additional day costs us nearly $1.3 million. Several investors openly challenged Vincent. "Either we begin construction this week, or we replace project leadership." No one spoke to Vincent that way, yet he remained perfectly calm. He walked toward the window overlooking Maple Street. "Tell me something." The room fell silent. "If excavation begins tomorrow, and 6 months later we discover this land should never have been disturbed, how much would that mistake cost?" One investor laughed. "Hypothetical history doesn't concern shareholders." Vincent slowly turned toward him. "No, it concerns conscience." The meeting ended without a vote. No one noticed that Vincent had already made his decision. That night he drove back to Grace's house. No security convoy, no lawyers, no cameras. Grace was surprised to find him standing alone beneath the old oak tree. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vincent reached into his coat pocket. Instead of a contract, he removed an old black and white photograph. It showed a group of children standing beside a school bus sometime in the early 1960s. In the background stood the same oak tree, the same hillside, the same property. "My father kept this picture until the day he died," Vincent said quietly. He never explained why. Grace studied the photograph. Near the edge of the image stood a broad-shouldered volunteer firefighter wearing a heavy coat. His face was partially hidden, but stitched onto the uniform was one name: Whitmore. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. "My grandfather." Vincent nodded. "I believe so." Before either of them could say another word, Walter slowly opened the front door. He stared at the old photograph from across the porch. For the first time in years, the confusion disappeared from his eyes. His voice became steady. almost young again. They never thanked him. Grace and Vincent looked at him in stunned silence. Walter stepped toward the oak tree, pointing beyond the empty neighborhood where construction was supposed to begin. They blamed the explosion. But your grandfather saved every child before the bridge collapsed. His breathing grew heavier. They buried the story because powerful people would have lost everything. A moment later, the clarity vanished. Walter looked around in confusion, unable to recognize either of them. He quietly asked Grace where his wife had gone, then wandered back inside. Neither Grace nor Vincent moved. The night had become completely still. Vincent looked once more at Arthur's photograph, before speaking almost to himself. If Walter's memory returned for even 30 seconds, then someone spent 60 years making sure the rest of this town forgot. He unfolded Arthur's map again. For the first time, he noticed a second mark hidden beneath the fold. It wasn't pointing toward the resort site. It pointed toward an abandoned stone bridge less than half a mile away. Next to it, Arthur had written one final sentence in fading ink. The truth did not begin where they buried the records. It began where the children survived. The abandoned stone bridge stood hidden behind a grove of towering pines less than half a mile from Maple Street. Most people in Ashcroft had forgotten it even existed. The county had built a newer bridge decades earlier, leaving the original structure to slowly surrender to weeds, moss, and time. Just after sunrise, Grace, Vincent, Eli, and Eleanor Hayes walked the narrow trail leading toward it. Walter had insisted on coming. Although his memory faded from 1 hour to the next, he refused to stay behind. "I know the way," he kept saying. No one had the heart to argue. When they reached the bridge, Vincent unfolded Arthur Whitmore's map once again. For the first time, the markings made perfect sense. The red line wasn't indicating a buried object. It traced the exact route of an old school bus. Grace slowly looked toward the valley below. The drop was nearly 70 feet. If a bus had gone over, Eleanor finished the sentence, no one would have survived. Walter stopped near the weathered stone railing. His hands trembled as they rested on the cold granite. Then something remarkable happened. He closed his eyes. For several seconds, the confused old man disappeared. His voice became steady. "I was 12. Everyone froze. I wasn't supposed to skip school that morning." He smiled faintly, as though watching another lifetime unfold before him. We all heard the crack. The bridge gave way. His breathing grew heavier. The bus slid sideways. Grace had never heard her father speak so clearly. Not in years. Walter continued. The driver screamed for everyone to stay still, but the rear wheels kept slipping. He pointed toward the middle of the bridge. Arthur ran. He didn't think. He just ran. The image formed inside everyone's imagination. A volunteer firefighter, sprinting toward a collapsing bridge. Children trapped inside a school bus. Seconds separating life from death. Walter's eyes filled with tears. He broke the emergency window. He carried the little ones out first. Then the older kids. He went back again. And again. Until everyone was safe. Walter's voice cracked. When the bridge finally collapsed, he was still inside. Silence settled over the valley. Only the sound of the river below broke the stillness. Grace covered her mouth. She had spent her entire life believing her grandfather had died from a routine accident while volunteering as a firefighter. No one had ever mentioned a school bus. No one had ever spoken about dozens of rescued children. Eleanor whispered the question everyone was thinking. If Arthur saved them, why doesn't anyone know? Walter frowned. The clarity began slipping away. They said, he struggled to remember. They said investors would leave. The railroad deal, the election. They couldn't let the town become known for a disaster. His eyes wandered. They made everyone promise. And after enough years, people forgot. Moments later, the confusion returned. Walter looked at Grace with childlike uncertainty. "Did your mother pack lunch today?" The memory was gone. But it had lasted long enough. Back in town, Eleanor refused to wait. She spent the afternoon digging through newspaper archives stored in the Chronicle's basement. Every issue from the week Arthur died contained only a brief headline. "Local firefighter killed during emergency response." No details, no location, no mention of children, no mention of a bridge, no photographs. It was as though someone had deliberately removed the heart of the story before it reached the printing press. Then Eleanor noticed something even stranger. Several pages from that week's newspaper had been replaced with reprinted copies produced years later. Someone had rewritten history. At DeMarco Holdings, the atmosphere had turned openly hostile. The investors demanded one final decision. Daniel Cross placed a termination agreement on the conference table. "If excavation doesn't begin tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "the board will remove you as project chairman." Several executives nodded. One investor leaned forward. "History is sentimental. Business is reality." Vincent remained expressionless. Instead of signing the document, he slid Arthur Whitmore's journal across the table. No one touched it. "Read page 38. An impatient investor opened the journal. His confidence faded within seconds. The handwritten account described the rescue in vivid detail, including the names of every child Arthur had carried from the bus before the bridge collapsed beneath him. There were 23 names. Vincent laid another document beside it. The blacked-out county report. Then the photograph. Then the original survey map. One by one, the pieces formed a story that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Daniel looked up slowly. "If this becomes public," Vincent interrupted him. "It will." The room fell silent. An older board member removed his glasses. "My father," he hesitated, "was one of those children." Everyone turned toward him. "I always wondered why he left flowers near the old bridge every October. He never explained." The realization spread around the room like a wave. This wasn't simply forgotten history. Many of Ashcroft's most influential families owed their existence to Arthur Whitmore. They just hadn't known it. Late that evening, Eleanor published the first article she had written without waiting for official approval. She included copies of Arthur's journal, the bridge records, and the photograph. Within hours, the story spread far beyond Ashcroft. Former residents began commenting online. One woman uploaded a faded family picture showing her grandfather standing beside Arthur. Another man revealed a box of letters his mother had hidden for decades. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Grace answered. The elderly voice on the other end introduced herself as Dorothy Mercer, 94 years old. "I was the little girl Arthur carried out of the bus first." Grace closed her eyes. Dorothy continued softly. "I've kept something for 62 years because Arthur asked me to wait until the town was ready." She paused. "I think that time has finally come." Before hanging up, Dorothy gave Grace an address. Inside the small wooden box she had protected for more than 6 decades, she said, was the final piece of evidence Arthur had never managed to hide beneath Maple Street. And without it, no one would ever understand why he had willingly sacrificed everything. Grace, Eli, Vincent, and Eleanor drove to Dorothy Mercer's farmhouse the following morning. The small white house sat alone on a hillside, overlooking Ashcroft, surrounded by wildflowers that had somehow survived decades of changing seasons. Dorothy, now 94, greeted them with slow but determined steps. Though age had bent her back, her eyes remained remarkably sharp. "I've been waiting a very long time," she said softly. She led them to a cedar cabinet in the corner of her living room and carefully removed a small wooden box wrapped in a faded blue blanket. "I promised Arthur I would only open this if the truth was ever in danger of disappearing forever." Grace recognized the handwriting on the lid immediately. It matched the journal hidden beneath her basement. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters. There were photographs, a sheriff's incident report with signatures that had never appeared in the official archives, a newspaper front page that had never been published, and one sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the people of Ashcroft." Grace unfolded the brittle paper. The letter had been written by Arthur Whitmore only hours before he died. If you are reading this, then someone finally chose truth over convenience. What happened on that bridge was never about me. It was about 23 children who deserved to grow up without carrying guilt for surviving. If my name must disappear so the town can heal, then let it disappear. But never let anyone destroy the place where those children were given a second chance. One day, people will believe progress requires forgetting. When that day comes, remind them that communities are not built by what they construct. They are built by what they choose to protect. No one spoke after Grace finished reading. Even Vincent quietly lowered his head. For the first time, he understood why the old survey marker beneath the oak tree had disturbed him so deeply. His father had never spoken about Arthur because he had been one of the 23 children rescued that morning. The photograph Vincent had carried his entire life was never meant to be a family keepsake. It was a silent thank you. That afternoon, Vincent called an emergency town meeting. The high school gymnasium filled long before sunset. Some residents arrived expecting another debate over property rights. Others assumed DeMarco Holdings had finally decided to seize Grace's land through the courts. Instead, a large screen displayed Arthur's photographs. Then Eleanor presented copies of the original documents. The unpublished newspaper, the sheriff's report, the bridge investigation. Finally, Grace stepped onto the stage and read Arthur's final letter aloud. The gymnasium became completely silent. Several elderly residents began crying before she reached the last paragraph. One by one, people stood, not to applaud, but because many realized they were children, grandchildren, or relatives of the 23 students Arthur had saved. Mayor Thomas Callahan slowly approached the microphone. His voice trembled. "My grandfather served on the town council in 1964. He paused. "I grew up believing Arthur Whitmore died during a routine rescue." He looked directly at Grace. "I never knew my own family helped bury the rest of the story." Without another word, he publicly apologized, not only to Grace, but to every member of the Whitmore family. When the meeting ended, everyone expected Vincent to announce that DeMarco Holdings was abandoning the resort. Instead, he unveiled a completely redesigned master plan. The luxury hotel would move nearly half a mile east. The entrance road would be rerouted. Grace's home would remain exactly where it had stood for generations. The ancient oak tree would become the center of a public memorial park. The abandoned stone bridge would be restored, not for traffic, but as a historical landmark. Arthur Whitmore's hidden chamber beneath the house would never become a tourist attraction. Instead, it would be carefully preserved as a private historical archive managed jointly by the Whitmore family and the town museum. Some investors protested. Several threatened lawsuits. Vincent listened without interruption. Then he quietly purchased their shares himself. The decision cost him hundreds of millions of dollars. He never mentioned the number again. Months later, construction resumed. The resort still brought jobs. Restaurants still opened. Families still returned to Ashcroft. But every visitor entered through a memorial garden where a simple bronze plaque stood beneath the old oak tree. It read, "Some places are worth more than the land beneath them, because they carry the courage that shaped an entire community." Grace never sold the house. Instead, she accepted Vincent's invitation to lead the new Maple Heritage Center, where local children learned the true history of their town. Every Friday afternoon, after finishing her school bus route, She welcomed visitors into the restored exhibit. She always began the tour the same way. This isn't the story of a billionaire. It isn't even the story of my grandfather. It's the story of what happens when ordinary people choose others before themselves. Eli eventually left for college to study history and public preservation. His first research project focused on forgotten heroes whose names had disappeared from official records. Eleanor's investigative series won National Journalism Awards. More importantly to her, it inspired dozens of other communities to re-examine local stories that had quietly vanished over time. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after everything had changed, Grace wheeled Walter into the backyard. The oak tree glowed beneath golden leaves. Children laughed in the nearby Memorial Park. The sound of a school bus echoed through Maple Street. Walter stared at the garden for several long moments. Then, unexpectedly, his tired eyes became clear. He smiled. Arthur planted that tree. Grace's heart stopped. Her father hadn't spoken with such certainty in months. He said, Walter whispered, if it ever became big enough to shade children again, we'd know everything turned out all right. A single tear rolled down Grace's cheek. She squeezed his hand. For a brief moment, the disease that had stolen so much simply stepped aside. Father and daughter sat together beneath the same branches Arthur had planted decades earlier. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Across the street, Vincent stood quietly beside his car, preparing to leave town after one final inspection. Daniel Cross walked over and asked the question many investors had wondered since the beginning. Was preserving one old house really worth changing a $4.8 billion project? Vincent looked toward Grace's porch, then toward the children playing beneath the oak tree. Finally, he smiled. The project was never about building the most expensive resort. He paused. It was about deciding what kind of place deserved to exist after we were gone. He climbed into his car and drove away without another word. As the afternoon sun settled over Maple Street, a yellow school bus rolled slowly past the Memorial Garden. New homes now stood where empty lots had once waited for demolition. Families waved from freshly painted porches, children raced bicycles beneath newly planted trees, and at the end of the street, the old cedar house remained exactly where it had always been, no longer the obstacle to progress, but the quiet reminder that the strongest foundations are never poured from concrete. They are built from memory, gratitude, and the courage of ordinary people whose greatest acts are often remembered far too late.